All right. Good evening, everybody. This is Mark Malloy with Emerging Revolutionary War, and we have a very special guest this evening. All right. Good evening, everybody. This is Mark Malloy with Emerging Revolutionary War. Sorry, got a little feedback there. But yeah, so this is Mark Malloy with Emerging Revolutionary War. We have a very special guest with us tonight. It is Wade Katz, who is an archaeologist who has been working on multiple Revolutionary War battlefields for many years throughout all across the eastern seaboard. Today, we're going to be talking about a pretty amazing archaeological discovery that was found at the Red Bank battlefield this summer. Mr. Katz here was actually part of that project and helped in an amazing discovery of human remains on the battlefield. So we're going to have him here this evening to talk to us about that. First, we're going to talk about, get a little background on the location of the battle, Fort Mercer. Then we're going to also talk about the Battle of Red Bank, what happened there, and then talk about, what was discovered this summer. And kind of what we can learn from this discovery, which I think is pretty amazing. We've had archaeologists on here before, and it always adds an interesting dimension because there's nothing like quite finding the physical evidence of combat and warfare in the actual ground. Something that can either tie together some of the written accounts, or it can also give us new insights on things that we previously thought we already knew. Right before we get started, just want to invite everybody, make sure you all follow Emerging Revolutionary War on your social media. We have a bus tour coming up in 2 weeks up at Valley Forge in Monmouth, which is actually sold out. So we're fully sold out on that. And so hopefully you can get your tickets for next year. We're going to be talking about what we're going to do for our bus tour next year in a couple weeks. So stay tuned about that. But yeah, so I'll go ahead and I'm going to turn it over to Wade and let him give us a little background on the Battle of Red Bank and what they discovered up there this past summer. So thank you, Wade, for joining us.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this. My team, the project team, has been trying to still work on the objects and the artifacts and how we present this. So what I'm presenting is kind of as we're progressing with some of the work that we're doing. And just as kind of background, my training is in archaeology and history. And as you mentioned, I've done a lot of projects on American battlefields, a lot of Revolutionary War battlefields, and a number of those have been American Battlefield Protection Program grants. So I have worked on kind of a range of sites throughout the Northeast. But the Delaware River Valley is an area that I've done a fair amount of work in, and had done a project at Red Bank Battlefield Park in about 7 years ago, where we did kind of the first systematic archaeological survey of the park. And at that time, we're also looking for, through ground penetrating radar, trying to identify potential human remains. So what I thought I would do today would be to kind of go through the stages of the project and give everybody just a little brief background on the battle and on the site, so that you have a sense of where you are. I don't know where everybody's coming from that's attending this, so some may know. I apologize if it's information you already know about Philadelphia and the setting in the Delaware River, but for those who are from further away, maybe that's not the case. So, and then I'll go through some of the archaeology that we've done and kind of what our next steps with the archaeology are. So I'm going to share my screen here, see if this works.
Yep. And for our viewers, if anybody has any questions or anything, go ahead, drop them in the chat box, and we can ask Wade some of your questions as we go along.
So just checking to see that this is sharing. Are you seeing a screen?
Yep. Yeah, we got your.
Okay. Great.
Thank you.
So just want to point out this project was funded by two sources, initially by a New Jersey Historical Commission grant, and then supplemented by and supported by Gloucester County, funding from the county itself. And also that while I may be the one who's speaking right now, there is a massive project team involved in this, and the project team changes and kind of grows as we go. So my co-director on this is Jen Janofsky, who is the director at Red Bank Battlefield Park and also teaches public history at Rowan University. And also my co-archaeologist in this was Dana Link, who has his own firm called Great Chain Archaeological Consulting. Some of you may be familiar with him. He used to work for the National Park Service and FEMA up in, I just lost Sandy Hook in New Jersey. Oh, and just also by introduction, I'm my own consulting archaeologist with South River Heritage Consulting. We've also included Anna Delaney and Stuart Alexander, who are with the New Jersey State Police Forensic Unit. One is the anthropologist, Anna is the anthropologist, and Stuart is the forensic dentist. And then David Orr, who is a retired National Park Service archaeologist and temple archaeologist, was involved in the project, along with Tom Christ, who is at Utica and is a forensic anthropologist, biological anthropologist. And then a number of people from Westchester University, Dr. Heather Holy. I had 2 interns from Westchester. And then as the project developed and we began to find more human remains, we had other volunteer professional archaeologists who came out and worked with us, a number of people such as Rich Veit, Barb Silber, Ian Burrow, and Drew Stanzeski. But then we also were supported by amazing avocational archaeologists and volunteers. And we had over 100 volunteers who worked on this project just in the early stages when it was a public archaeology program. And then when we began to kind of change its direction and it morphed into a human remains investigation, we had a group of dedicated archaeologists or volunteers who came and worked with us day in and day out, sometimes 7 days a week, to see that we were able to recover this site and do what we needed to do. And in all times that we did this, particularly as the archaeology project starts out as a public program, there's a great deal of excitement and fun and discovery, and you want it to be an exciting opportunity for the public. When it changes into a human remains project, you need to recognize that any sets of human remains need to be treated with dignity and respect. There's a sense that this is a death scene investigation. It may be 240 some years old, but it is still a death scene investigation, and it requires you to be really careful about what it is that you do. A little bit of background about Red Bank Battlefield Park itself. It's a 44-acre park located in Gloucester County, New Jersey, across the Delaware River from the greater Philadelphia area, say the Philadelphia airport, kind of a little bit south and below the city of Philadelphia, or kind of below where the Schuylkill River comes out on the west side. It's maintained by Gloucester County's Department of Parks and Recreation, and they get about 200,000 visitors to the park every year. It's a beautiful space. It's got recreational trails that are there for people to enjoy. The remnants of Fort Mercer are there, and that's really the area that we're going to be talking about here. And you can see there the image of the monument that was put up in the early 20th century to commemorate the battle. And then 1748 James Whittle house is here, and that is the house. The Whittle family was a Quaker family on this property, and the Americans, Patriot Force, came in the spring of 1777 and basically built a fort on the Quaker-held farmland that was here. And this dramatically affected the Whittles in how they kind of did things for years to come after this. Another image of the park, as I said, the Fort Mercer is what we were trying to work on here and look at. And so this again is just another image of that space. The fort was an earthen fortification. It was started in, as I said, in the spring of 1777. The battle is fought in October of 1777. So over that period of March to October, the fort had yet to really be completed. So much of it was done, but they were still literally working on it the day of or the day before the battle. It is here as a portion of the defensive series of defenses that were there to protect the Delaware River from naval forces trying to take Philadelphia. So across the river to the west from Fort Mercer is Fort Mifflin. And in between Fort Mercer and Fort Mifflin were a series of obstructions or chevaux de fray, which were sunken into the river to prevent ships from coming up the channel. You could rip the bottom out of a vessel on the chevaux de fray. And there was a small Pennsylvania Navy, small but powerful Pennsylvania Navy that was here, made up of row galleys and small vessels, generally carrying only one gun in the bow, but powerful, and a real strike force that could be, if you could limit the maneuverability of a large warship and attack with a small galley, you could actually disable those larger vessels. So the British had a very healthy respect for the Pennsylvania Navy. And the Pennsylvania Navy figures very prominently in the fight that occurs here in 1777. Again, just to orient you as to where we are, this is admittedly, this is a 1777 map, so this might not help many of you if you're not familiar with the area. But you can see the upper right corner is what Philadelphia looked like in 1777. It's a city of probably about 20,000 to 25,000 people, one of the largest in the British Empire. And then as you come down the Delaware River and make the bend, you see where Fort Mercer or Red Bank were located. Across the river, and on an island actually across the river, is the location of Fort Mifflin. And so these are the two major defensive points on the river. Red Bank is referred to as Red Bank because there's a bluff along the Delaware River here that's almost 30 to 40 feet high. And you would be sitting up and above any vessels, any naval vessels that might be coming up the river at this point. So the American force that defends Red Bank or Fort Mercer is principally made up of the 1st and 2nd Rhode Island regiments, commanded by Colonel Christopher Greene. Greene is a relative of Nathaniel Greene. I think he's a cousin, as I recall. Those two regiments are the balance of the force. There seems to have been conceivably some men from the 6th Virginia that were here. It's a little hard to know because sometimes these forces were going back and forth between Fort Mifflin and Fort Mercer. So whether they actually were in the fort at the time of the attack or they're there immediately after or immediately before, that's somewhat debatable. There also was an artillery detachment here, and there probably were some New Jersey militia that came in afterwards, immediately afterwards. It looks like Greene tried to have the militia not in the defense force, at least during the fight. In that 1st and 2nd Rhode Island regiments were African-American soldiers and Native American soldiers. And so it's really important for this as a significant battle for Americans to recognize that this is one of those places that the defense force here was a racially mixed force. And anywhere from probably 10 to 15% of the defense force was composed of African-Americans and Native Americans from Rhode Island. So the defense force totaled somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 600 men, maybe a little bit less than that. And they had 14 guns spread throughout the fort. Against them was a Hessian Grenadier Brigade, reinforced brigade, commanded by Emil Karl von Donop. You see him on the right-hand side of the image. His brigade consisted of 3 Grenadier battalions, Lengerke, Linsing, and Minnegerode, and then a musketeer regiment, the Musketeer von Mirbach Regiment. A Hessian Field Jaeger Corps unit was attached here, and there was a Royal Artillery unit. And the Royal Artillery unit principally is the only British force that's attached to this. So this is very much a Hessian attack on an American military site. And if you look at the number of assaulting forces, you have approximately 2,400 officers and men that are in that brigade. Of that number, only the 3 that you see with check marks next to him, the von Linsing, Minnegerode, and Mirbach regiments, are the units that actually were in the assault. The other Grenadier Battalion was held back in reserve. The Jaegers were used on the flank, particularly to try to keep the naval vessels from firing and to use their rifles to try to keep the naval vessels from firing. And the Royal Artillery howitzers did engage in the fight. But in terms of the actual assault itself, it's those 3 principal battalions that did it. So the force that's defending the fortification is outnumbered by at least 4 to 1, and the assault force probably makes it more like 2.5 to 3 to 1 as far as the attack. On the afternoon of the attack, and it's on October 22nd, 1777, von Donop's brigade had made its way from Philadelphia down the New Jersey side, had crossed at Camden, or what is now Camden, and had come down to attack the fort at what turns out to be late afternoon of the 22nd of October. The Von Donop summons the garrison to surrender and tells them there will be no quarter if they don't surrender. And the Hessians are feeling rather powerful. The Grenadier forces are very powerful soldiers, some of your best in the Hessian army at the time. Colonel Christopher Green is said to have responded basically, I await you. I don't expect any quarter, and I don't anticipate giving any quarter. Very much the 18th century answer that General McAuliffe uses at Bastogne, which is nuts. Go ahead and attack if you want to attack. So I kind of admire Christopher Green for his statements that he made here.
And this fort is in the broader scale of things. Philadelphia had fallen back in September, and were these kind of like holdouts along the river that they wanted to get rid of in order to open up the river? Or?
Yes, thanks, Mark. I probably should have addressed that. That's exactly right. The fortifications were still being held, and what the British had found, what the Royal Army found, was that they took Philadelphia, but they didn't hold the countryside, and they couldn't supply themselves because the Royal Navy is where their supplies would come from. If you can't open up the Delaware River for your fleet to come and supply you, you're in serious trouble. So they needed to reduce these fortifications along the Delaware River. And you know that after they seized Philadelphia in late September, you still have the Battle of Germantown in early October, October 4th. So this is October 22nd that this occurs. And this intent here, the Hessians may very well have been trying to save face and recover some bad PR that they felt that they were suffering. They had not performed particularly well at the Battle of Brandywine. They had not done very well earlier at Trenton. And there was some kind of, sense within the British Army that these guys aren't all they're cracked up to be, even though they had done a fantastic job in November 1776 of seizing Fort Washington in New York. So the assault on the evening of the 4th looks something like this, and this is taken from a fairly recent publication about the battle, and you can see a series of assault lines, the fortification with Green's brigade inside. The fort wall itself is nearly 350 yards long, or almost 1,000 feet. It's a massive, massive fortification, far too large for what Green's garrison consisted of. So you see over here on this side where his unit is shown, this was a smaller redoubt that he had built an interior wall across the inside of the fort and essentially abandoned all of this section of the fortification. Well, the Hessian forces, when they assault, don't know that. So you have one of the Grenadier battalions, that comes over the north wall of the fort. The Minigorod battalion, the von Mirbach Musketeer battalion comes into the fort at the gate, and the other Grenadier battalion attacks at the southern end of the fort. These first two battalions, when they seize the fort, seize the old section of the fort, think they have won, and they're cheering and extremely happy about it, and then find themselves caught in a crossfire between the wall, the men that are firing at them from this wall, and the American naval vessels that are sitting out in the river firing into their right flank and rear, which is a decimating assault. The assault force, the battle itself lasts for about 40 to 45 minutes. At no time do Hessian forces make it into that defensive citadel at all. And in fact, they're stopped. Some are stopped close by in the abattis and along the ditch of this section of the fortification. But essentially, they are decimated and driven back with heavy, heavy losses. Von Donop is mortally wounded and captured. The commanding officer of the Mirbach regiment is killed on the battlefield, and one of the other battalion commanders is also mortally wounded. It's a real disaster. About 24 to 28% of the assault force was killed or wounded in the attack, and the number of wounded just kept going up. So the Hessian forces retreat back to Haddonfield that night and get back over to Philadelphia the following day. And you can, if you read the first-person accounts, you'll get an interesting sense of the essentially what we would define today as PTSD it's very, very obvious that this battle severely impacted many of these soldiers. Many of the officer class were rattled, seriously rattled by this fight. They hadn't seen that many casualties in any particular place. One of them mentions that I lost 5 of my best friends. You know, this kind of an engagement was a very, very bloody engagement. So kind of go forward in time. I'm going to leave the rest of the battle and the siege alone. The battle is an American victory. The American forces come out of the next day and immediately begin to bury the dead on the battlefield. And generally the consensus is they buried them in the ditches of the fort or in other ditches or trenches that they prepared. And these 2 maps give you a sense of what that is. The map on the right was prepared by Johann Ewald, one of the Jaegers that was on the site. And you see the circle up in the upper corner. He's identifying the place where a number of the officers were buried, the grave where the officers were buried. And you see another map here on the other, on the left-hand side from Benson Losing's volume, which is a derivative of another map, of an earlier map about the same period of time. But you see the location of where soldiers' graves are identified, which is below and south of that main section of the fort. And von Donop, having been mortally wounded, he is buried on the battlefield with his men. Over the course of the next 200 and some years, we have lost about 120 feet of river shoreline to erosion in the Delaware River. Those burials all washed into the river by about the 1860s. So the general consensus has always been that those bodies washed into the river a long, long, long time ago. And if you look at any of the documentation that exists, the bodies were being buried south of the fortification. Now I'll come forward now a little bit to where we did this work. And so here's a topo map that shows the location of where Red Bank Battlefield is, the battlefield park you see kind of underneath the red outline here. And the dark line points to where the actual space is that we worked in. That is actually identifying a small quarter-acre parcel that was recently acquired by the county and added to the park. So the archaeological project we were doing here was to try to do a baseline level investigation, get a sense of what's there, what's in this little space, what's in this new area. You could tell just by standing and looking along the line of the former fort entrenchment that the ditch extended into this quarter-acre parcel. And so our intent was to sample what was in the ditch, but also look at what else was on the parcel and see what kinds of information might be there archaeologically that the park could use in interpretation and understanding. We developed this into a public archaeology program so that it would be a way to engage the community in their own archaeology, their own history. This is a slightly closer view of where it is. You see in the green area, this is the parkland, and our quarter-acre parcel I'm referring to as the project area. If I superimpose this on a map that shows the ditch line of the fort, you would see the ditch of the fort runs almost parallel to this walking path, this white walking path, then cuts through the area that we were in, and then it would have bent and probably bent through this park and along this line up to what is now Beach Hill Road. So in all likelihood, everybody who built a house in this portion of National Park Borough was digging into the old section of the fortification at the time that they did it. Now, this National Park Borough has been around for more than 100 years. So it's been a town and a village and a borough for quite a long period of time. And a number of the people who live in that area have recovered artifacts at various times in their yards. So we know that this is, you know, that the potential is always there for artifacts to be discovered. So if you look at that area, and I'm identified it here as the approximate project area on a map that was done at the time, probably by one of the French engineers or French artillery officers that was associated with the battle, you see the area that I'm identifying as the possible location of our quarter acre. The main portion of the fort you can clearly see outlined here. It had an abattis that are cut trees that went around it, cut and sharpened trees, and then you had a ditch that went with it, and a kind of a campium that had been built, a smaller bastion off this corner. But this also clearly shows you what was the old fortification and the way it was built. Now, I draw your attention to this map because we have 4 or 5 period maps that were done, and each one is slightly different than the other. So what the archaeology can help with here is trying to understand how this fort in and of itself was built and how was it laid out. So that was another one of the things we had hoped to try to determine when we did this project. Could we learn anything about the way the fort was built? So as part of this work that we did, it started while we did the most recent field work in 2022, beginning in the summer. We had actually started this clear back in the fall of 2021 when anthropology students from Westchester University came over and did ground penetrating radar in this parcel and in the space that we were in. And then we came back in the early spring of 2022 and did a metal detector survey across the quarter-acre parcel as well to see what kinds of information might be within the range of a metal detector, usually within that surface 8 to 10 inches of soil. In both of these images, I think what's really important to notice, particularly in the one where you see the metal detector, is in the background, you can see the fortification ditch as it currently exists inside the Gloucester County Park. So if you can see my cursor, you can see where that's moving across there. And where this young woman is doing the ground penetrating radar, the ditch is in the background here, and she is in a very, very shallow depression. What we see in the background here behind where the metal detectors are is in the 1930s, one of the branches of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, came in and enhanced this fort ditch. They cleaned it out, they made it deeper, they made it so people could come and see it and look really cool. Nobody ever did that on this piece of property. It had always been a privately owned piece of ground. So it offered a real potential to look inside this ditch and see what it contained. So then we began the testing, and this gives a good image of the way we tried to do this, which was, my plan was to do a checkerboard pattern across this space. We weren't anticipating 100% excavation. We were just trying to sample what was inside the ditch. So we put a series of units that would go across this space and try to just get down to the base of the ditch. Now, once we encountered human remains, we changed that excavation pattern and ended up with what a 10-foot wide, and each of these units is 5 feet. So this is a 10-foot wide section by 30 feet long. So we excavated a trench, hand excavated a trench, 30 feet wide, 10 feet wide and 30 feet long. This gives another idea of how it was during the course of the excavations. You can see that what we were trying to do was connect these units together to get a contiguous or continuous trench line, which would provide us with a soil profile of how that ditch looks along this wall and along this wall. And ultimately what we ended up doing was excavating the unit where you see the yellow bucket and the unit adjacent to where this person is. You see what the kind of finished product is, if you will, underneath the image on the right-hand side. We had a shelter that the county very generously provided so that we could, once we began to hit human remains and we knew we were opening up a larger space, it was helpful to kind of keep prying eyes out, and so you could keep that covered. That also was great for in the heat of the summer for kind of keeping us cool and keeping the sun off of our heads, so it worked out really well. The map that you see on the left shows you the scarp wall of the fort, which is back in this section of the photograph, and the fort ditch is the space, everything is in between. So kind of from here in the ditch to here in the ditch is the fort ditch. In the excavation, that's the fort ditch. The red marks that you see here note the identified crania that we excavated. So that's where we had crania or skulls. Now, minimum number of individuals that we identified here is 15. When I think if you saw the various newspaper coverages and things, we were at 13 at that point. But since that time, 2 more in the course of excavation and then in the course of analysis of the soil groupings or the soil clump, if you will, because that's kind of how we brought them out of the ground. Turned out that we had 2 individuals where we thought we had 1. So number 1 and number 15 are together.
And you weren't anticipating this discovery at all, were you?
No. So as I explained earlier, the general consensus was the human remains were not in this portion of the fort. Now, our ground penetrating radar did identify a possible anomaly at the base of the ditch, but it wasn't clear what that anomaly was going to be. So when we hit the ditch, when we hit the base of the ditch, the intent, what I was anticipating was that we would see kind of the detritus of a fortification abandoned and destroyed and material thrown into the bottom of the ditch. In earlier projects throughout over the last 100 or so years, all kinds of artifacts have been found at Red Bank, including cannon barrels that were found where that 1906 monument was put up. They were in the ground where that monument went in, or very close to where that was. A 10-plate stove was found in that space. I mean, there's been all kinds of artifacts that have been found in these spaces throughout the park. So the possibility was not that it was going to be human remains, but that it was going to be something related to the occupation and use of the fort. In retrospect, when you look at the way infantry forces assaulted the fort and where casualties occurred, it makes perfect sense that this is probably the location that you would find bodies. I mean, one of the arguments that you can have when you read those first-person accounts, and if you only rely on those first-person accounts, it would suggest that all the bodies were picked up and moved and buried somewhere else. Intuitively, that just doesn't sound right. Like, if you're trying to get them off the field as quickly as you can, why would you make that much effort to move them around? So what we are now finding as we looked in this space is these were very much expedient burials. What the remains were placed in this ditch as quickly and expeditiously as possible. Now, I said that I was trying to maybe think about how this fort was built and what we could learn about how the fort was built. So I'm going to back up just a moment to talk about that before I go back to the human remains. But this is another one of the number of images that we have of Red Bank Fort. And so you can see the way it's laid out. You can see the abattis along the side, the citadel area here, and the fortification wall. In all likelihood, the area that we worked on is right about here, very close to where we think the gate to the fort was. But I call your attention to this quote because this was one of the French engineers who came over early in the war to support the Americans. Du Coudray was not considered to be a very pleasant person, and in all likelihood, he is accidentally drowned not too long. I think of the day of the Battle of Brandywine, he's in the Philadelphia area and is accidentally drowned. That may have actually been a positive thing for the American cause, just because he created a lot of issues with a lot of the people that he dealt with. But the fortification at Red Bank was laid out by Colonel John Bull, who was a militia officer from Pennsylvania. So he had a militia unit here from March through June, July, and actually had the 1st Pennsylvania State Regiment here as well, working on this property. And I find this statement to be kind of interesting from Du Coudray, where he basically says that the fort at Red Bank isn't such a bad fortification because John Bull, and this is sort of like being damned with faint praise, didn't use any other assistance but natural good sense, unenlightened by theory. So we're trying to understand how this fort is built and, what elements should be in it and how would it be put together. We may not, I could go to every published volume there is on how a fort is supposed to look. I don't know that John Bull used that. And so this one I find really useful to think about because we're still having some discussions about what we think we saw in the way the fort itself is built. And to look at that, here's a image of one of the profiles. The east profile shows several of the excavation units, but you see this slope here where my cursor is. That's the scarp wall of the fort. That shape is not a shape I put there. That shape is there from the fortification when it was built in 1777. So as we excavated the soil down, that shape began to be obvious as we worked our way down. So the wall of the fort would be somewhere in the area of the left-hand side of this slide, and it would have been an earthen embankment. To create that embankment, you took the dirt that was in the ditch of the fort, so the base that you see here across the bottom of the screen or the bottom of the unit, all that dirt got piled up to build the fort wall. But you have to think about how do you hold that wall in place? And I have yet to figure that one out. So I'll be happy to know if anybody's got suggestions of what they think. We might have had gabions or fascines that were being used, but there's no obvious wooden staining or soil stains that would indicate any kind of a wooden frame that was used to do this. So we've got some ideas on this, and it'll be interesting to see as we kind of begin to look more and more at it, whether we can figure that one out. But that may be one of those questions that we're not able to answer at this point, and we'll have to use it for the next round of excavations that might occur. Now I'm going to back up again to the Hessian assault force and the battle itself and the aftermath with the human remains. Here's one of those first-person statements made by Lieutenant Colonel von Verm, who is with the Fieldjäger Corps. It's painful for me to lose so many good people. He is not directly involved in the fighting. He is not actually in the engagement, but he's there. And so he is part of the retreat, and he sees what the damages are. You can see here killed and wounded. We have two different officers that gave sources of information, but anywhere from 350 killed and wounded outright to 300, almost 400 killed and wounded outright. And that was out of an attacking force of about 1,400 men. So about 1,000 of that assault force of the assault brigade were not part of it, but 1,400 did participate. And now I want you to look at and this is the kind of thing where if you read these, it's one thing to read them. It's another thing to excavate these. And so I'll read through these and you all can do it from the screen, but this is what Johann Ewald reports in his journal. Right leg shot apart, both legs shot to pieces. These are the wounds and the damages that he is seeing on his colleagues. Shot through both legs, shot through the chest and right arm, through the leg, in the arm, right arm shot off, through the left leg, through the neck and head, left foot smashed, right leg shot to pieces, right knee smashed in the left knee. If you look at the top of the screen, you see that Colonel von Schick of the Mirbach Regiment was killed. Also 2 captains and 8 lieutenants. And wounded were 3 captains, 4 lieutenants, and 2 other colonels, including von Donop, who was mortally wounded. That's an amazingly high casualty rate among the officer corps for this force. But if you look at those types of wounds, that is the kind of damage we were seeing in the excavation. And now you read these first-person accounts like Sergeant John Smith, where he talks about burying bodies. He says, we buried 75 Hessians in one grave. And then another group were buried below the riverbank. There's no indication about where these were buried, just that they were being buried in the fort entrenchment. The ditch itself is a convenient place to bury bodies. And what we found when we excavated was that the bottom 6 to 8 inches of soil was the space that contained the human remains, as well as a large number of artifacts related to the battle itself. Now, I talked a little bit about the Navy that was here, but I think it's important when you look at what these vessels were, the kind of armament these vessels were carrying. These are big cannons. So you've got mostly 18-pounders, but also 24-pounders, and one of them's got a 32-pound gun. These are the kinds of guns that you would have that could cause the kind of damages that you just saw that Ewald is reporting. And then I want to draw your attention to this object that came to our attention after Scott Stevenson from the Museum of the American Revolution came out and visited the site. And he remembered that they had this on display not too much earlier. It's in a private collection. It belongs to, it's the powder horn of a John Burlingame of the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment, and he was at Red Bank. And take a good look at the imagery of what he draws on this. And it's a very primitive drawing. In fact, it's reminiscent to me of some of the Native American drawings of, say, the Little Bighorn battle, and you see, soldiers falling into the camp upside down. But if you look at this, you have headless corpses, you have disembodied heads, missing legs, missing arms. Without getting too gruesome, this is what we saw in the bottom of the ditch. the bodies that we saw, the remains that we saw, are not full, complete skeletons. And so that 15 minimum individuals that I defined for you is based on the one thing that everybody has only one of, and that's your head. So many of these are not, we have skulls or crania or portions thereof, but no skeletal remains other than that go with those. We have individual femurs, we have other sets of long bones, but they don't seem to articulate with any other bone as well. That's not to say that everybody we found looked like that, but most of them looked to be pieces, dismembered pieces of bodies.
Wow.
And we have at least one first-person account that says that the naval vessels were firing chain shot into the flank of the assault force. Now, chain shot is great for taking out masts. It's usually used on naval vessels, navy to navy or ship to ship, but it would be absolutely wonderful for taking out, or deadly for taking out, legs. And as he indicates here, knock down whole rows of men with chain shot. And it could also be capable of taking off your head, I would think. And in addition, musket shots at the distance that we're talking about could easily dismember arms and legs. So when you now look at that excavation area that I've described, this is another way to look at it, as after we've removed the human remains, every one of the little yellow stars is an indication of where the crania were located. And what you're seeing where the young woman is here, this is the edge of the scarp wall to the fort. So that slope is the exterior wall of the fort. The two red lines illustrate the base of the fort ditch. And from one red line to the other is about 13 feet across. You'll notice that every set of human remains that we found were in the ditch. They were not outside of the ditch, they were buried in the ditch. And then off here on the far left, this yellow line is another kind of a shelf edge, which I think, and we're currently hypothesizing, I am currently hypothesizing, that soil from the exterior side of the ditch was used to bury the bodies. And so obviously you wouldn't take it from the scarp wall of the fort, you need that. But this side you could work on the exterior portion of the fort, the counter scarp side essentially. You could take that dirt and throw it onto the bodies that are in the bottom. Now, just because I've indicated these as crania, that implies that there's open space in between. But in this area, for example, we had a series of long bones laid out, leg bones, if you will. In this area, we had a series of femurs laid out. Over in here, we have another series of femurs. So along the edge here, we may have had a full skeleton, and down in this area, we might have had somebody that was like that. Number 7, this one closest to the fort wall, had been hit by a musket ball in his hip, a lead canister shot in the middle of his back, and a grape shot in his arm. And then this gentleman here, number 8, had been hit 4 times by musket balls. So if you want that sense of that kind of crossfire and how intense the combat was and how intense the fire was, we're seeing it in the bottom of this ditch.
Wow. And now the crania too, were they intact skulls or were they just parts of them?
Bone preservation is very poor. So, and that's partly because you're in the bottom of the ditch where over 240 some years, you know, there's freeze thaw, there's moisture that is in the bottom of the ditch. They are not in great condition, and we're still in the process of processing those to see who's in good shape and who isn't. So what we define them basically is on your mandible or your maxilla, and then we have a lot of teeth that go with those. But some have more to the crania than others do, or their cranium than others do. And as we process them, and as I mentioned, because they were so fragile, they came out in a soil block. So we wouldn't completely clear the skull while it was in the ground. We would clear it to a point where you could then undercut it, lift it, and very carefully box it, wrap it up, box it, and take it to be analyzed in the lab, and the dirt will be removed in the lab. So we're still in the process of doing that level of processing. If we are able to get a full skull that we can see that way, there are some potentials of things that we could possibly do with that. So then I just mentioned a little bit about the munitions. The artifacts we have found are remarkably, when you think about what you could conceivably have found in an 18th century fortification, these are remarkably limited. So we have musket balls, and all but one of our musket balls is impacted. We had lead canister or case shot. We've had grape shot. And so on the left-hand side, you see a box of grape shot that is currently housed at Red Bank Battlefield. They literally find thousands. Over the years, they have found thousands and thousands of grape shot on the battlefield. The one that you see on the right-hand side is one that we excavated not too long ago during the course of the project. So we have several iron grape shot, about 1.5 inches across. We recovered blood residue off of the knee buckle that you see pictured here. And we tested, at least initially, we've tested some of the musket balls and one of the grape shot and this knee buckle. Now, blood residue has the potential for DNA extraction. So we plan to do more testing on a number of the other metal artifacts to see if we can't do that and get some DNA off of them.
Is there any DNA that can be tested from the bones that were discovered?
Yes, and I was going to get to that, but I can mention that now. We can possibly do DNA from teeth, and we do have, but 240-some-year-old DNA might not be very easy to extract, particularly in the kind of setting that we've been in. So while I'm cautiously optimistic that we will get some decent DNA. Now, we also know that from battlefield burials, context that Dr. Robert Selig and I worked on a number of years ago on battlefield burials. Most times battlefield burials, the skeleton or the body is buried is stripped of any usable material and buried as, in its shift or with no clothes at all. So boots, shoes, uniform coats, accoutrements, all that is removed from the body. So it was a little interesting that we began to find buttons in some very concentrated locations. And in the slide, the image that you see in the upper corner here, these are the buttons in situ. You can actually see them as we were excavating, these whole series of buttons that were showing up as if they're part of a coat, like you see on the right-hand side. Every one of the buttons we found, with the exception, well, I'll back up. We have pewter buttons and we have brass buttons. The pewter buttons are in such bad shape that the pewter doesn't even register as metal anymore. They have rotted to the point where you can't even see them that way. Brass buttons, every one of them looks like the one that you see in the center image or the image that you see on the left-hand side. Or, interestingly, on this uniform coat, which is actually from the 7th Regiment of the Prussian Infantry of the same era. So that's a musketeer or fusilier regiment coat. It's possible, and my working hypothesis right now is that the buttons that we recovered are related to the Mirbach Regiment, and these may be regimental coat buttons that go with the Mirbach Regiment. We'll do a lot more research on that to prove that, but that's my kind of working hypothesis. Some of you may have heard that we recovered a guinea. This is pretty remarkable, and in the 40-some years of archaeology that I've done in excavations, I have never found gold like that. And this was at the base of the fort ditch, about 4.5 feet down. A gold guinea like this was worth about 1 month's wages for the average Hessian private. So it was clearly a fairly valuable item to have. And so my thinking is, although all of these are kind of open to question, and you can see that with my questions that I've got there, did it belong to an officer? I'm inclined to think it did. On the other hand, was it hidden in somebody's coat or somebody's boot? Given the kinds of artifacts or the skeletal remains that we're finding, it could have been in either of those things. It could have been in a boot or a shoe of some kind. It's been suggested that it was somebody's keepsake and that they carried it for something like good luck. So all of those things are possibilities, all are things that we can try to explore and may very well be the explanation for why it's there. it is such a valuable item. If somebody had seen it, they wouldn't have left it in the ground. There's no way that the soldiers who buried these men would have said, I'm leaving a gold coin in the bottom of the ground. But then there's another possibility, which I think is really interesting. And this is one that as you do research and you come across, some of you may be familiar with John Fanning Watson and some of the material that he wrote in the early 19th century, sort of these early stories of Philadelphia and the southeastern PA. When he was visiting Brandywine Battlefield, he talks about meeting the gravedigger on the site, and he indicates that, if you watch the gravedigger, you may possibly see him turn up bones of some British soldier because he's at Birmingham Meeting House, which was a high density area where the fighting occurred. Burials are in the ground at Birmingham. So he suggests it could be a British soldier, or, and this is what I think is interesting, he says you may even be shown an old gold coin found concealed once in the great queue or hair of like a braided hair of a buried Hessian. Now, I don't know where he comes up with that statement. So some of your people listening, if you've got any ideas about this, I'd love to know if this is a folk tradition, if this is something that others have identified with Hessian soldiers. Remembering now, let's go back to what we were finding for sets of human remains. And in some cases, we're dealing with only heads. Could it be that the coin is associated with a head? And that's the reason nobody bothered to pick it up, is I'm not touching that. I'm going to leave that there. I'm not going to go through that. And then kind of quickly, other things we identified was a packet of material that consisted of a couple of gun flints, a few buttons, and you see the buttons there as these repoussé buttons here, and then an unfired musket ball. And it's the only unfired musket ball we found, and it's the only one that is a larger caliber ball. All of the other balls are of the right caliber for American or French muskets, is what they would have been. And this one has a little black streaking on it, which may be gunpowder residue. So we're going to try to get that tested to see if we know that for sure. We've done some interesting things here with the dental work. You can see that we did some portable x-rays of mandibles and teeth while we were in the field. And you can see on the left-hand side that some of the teeth are in remarkably amazing condition. And you could x-ray them in the field to get that sense of what was out there. And this is all because of our, when the New Jersey State Police allowed their forensic anthropologists and forensic dentists to be involved in our project, they could bring all kinds of resources to bear that on an average archaeological site, I wouldn't have been able to do.
Wow.
So our next steps are things like we're going to do X-rays and CT scans of all of the mandibles and bone and things that we have. We're going to try to do mitochondrial DNA, and you can get that best from teeth and cortical bone. But again, our bone is in such bad shape, and in some cases, our teeth consist almost exclusively of the enamel and no core structure to the teeth anymore. So as I said, I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll be able to get some of that. We're obviously going to do the more standard studies, which can be things like stable isotope analyses that will get us information on diet and hopefully location of where each of these men came from. Blood residue analysis, I mentioned earlier, we'll be able to see what kind of pathologies that might be here. And then the obvious ones of things like sex and age and stature and other things that you can get from a skeletal population. We're still in the process of working on the artifacts. We are hoping to test a number of those for some other things. We're going to have to do artifact conservation because in all likelihood, a lot of this is going to go on display somewhere. We're in the process of doing more detailed or minute military research, particularly on the military formations themselves and the soldiers that comprise those regiments, to see what we can learn about recruiting techniques and where did these soldiers come from. A lot of that material already exists in various repositories throughout the world, Germany as well as in the United States, but we're going to be focusing in on that. And also more information about the land use, the history of this space, the actual space itself, and what happened here over time. And finally, kind of things like there will be reinterment, but where, when, and by whom, those are all kind of things that are up in the air. So I think that's my last one, and I'll kind of go back to if you've got questions and things, maybe that's the way to.
Yeah, no, this is fantastic. I think it's amazing, what you can learn from this archaeology, what you were describing of actually finding, finding the evidence of just how awful and gory this combat actually was, which when we were talking before, just, people don't really associate this kind of gore with a Revolutionary War battle because it's often been romanticized through paintings in our history as just something, they fought there, but you don't really get the sense of this kind of just terrible, gruesome fighting that occurred and what you found there. We did get a question. Given this is from Patrick Ward. Given large number of Hessian casualties that occurred there, are there any plans to expand the search area, investigate other parts in that area?
That's a good question. The GPR, you kind of ground truth the ground penetrating radar. So we now have ground truth that we knew we had an anomaly there. That anomaly was definitely a set of human remains. So we know that in the immediate vicinity, in both directions, there are likely to be additional sets of human remains that we didn't touch within that 10-foot by 30-foot area we did. There will be more archaeology done, hopefully next summer, in a different section of the park. The whole concept that we've identified human remains, there's no need to continue to dig them up. Now we know they're there, and that ditch conceivably contains more. That leads a very different kind of process of what kinds of things do you want to do there and how would you do them. So I don't think you'll see anybody excavating more sets of human remains. If anything, what we'll try to do is perhaps pinpoint or document and identify where others are, and that this area, now that we know what that signature is, if you see that in the GPR again, you've probably got a ditch, another space in the ditch that's got human remains in it. I'd like to do some more work in the former section of the park, what was the park, not the quarter-acre park, but the other part, and the section that the WPA did their work in the ditch, because I wonder if they didn't go as deep as we did and only excavated out just to get that deeper ditch. That bottom 6 or 8 inches may still be intact in those places. So it's got, there will certainly be additional archaeology done. And I think Red Bank's got a potential to yield all kinds of information archaeologically that's it's a very, very rich site. Probably only just scratched the surface at this point.
Yeah, and I think going beyond just this one site, I think it really shows, the importance of preserving battlefields and the very real sense that battlefields, in many cases, are burial grounds, even when we don't know it. So I think that's, finding ways to preserve battlefields outside of what we typically think are the protected areas, where these burials happened are often sometimes right there, just on the phrase of the preserved land.
Yeah, that's true.
We also got a question about the Americans. Do we know if there are any American dead and if they were buried on site or not?
That's a good question. The casualty rate for the Hessian force, as I said, was 24 to 25% of the attack force. There were 14 Americans who were killed in the battle, and they, I think, were buried inside the fortification. There has been reference to uncovering what was referred to as Patriot bones back in the early 20th century, and why that's the identification, I'm not sure, but it would suggest that somebody knew that that's what they had. Perhaps it was regimental buttons or something that was on them that identified them that way. But they are not being thrown in the ditch the same way that the Hessian soldiers were being buried in the ditch. So I think we're looking at a different treatment of what the handful of soldiers killed in the garrison versus the large number that were killed, Hessian soldiers that were killed.
Yeah, interesting. All right. I think that's we got is there any plans to mark this in the near term or in the future as far as like describing this discovery?
I think it's been suggested, and the way we mapped these in was that each of the skull locations, those crania locations, we know where they are, so that you could pull a marker up to mark that actual location of where an individual cranium was identified. There is discussion about trying to more further commemorate this section of the park or do something in this section. That will have to be something that's discussed at the county level and within the county government as to how you might do that. At some point, the human remains will be reinterred. The question there is still exactly where that will be. You know, can you put them in a county public park, or do they have to go into a different space? Those are all discussions that are still being had. But there is no intention of holding these remains out and not putting them back in the ground. It's my opinion is, and it's just my opinion, they could go back in the space where we excavated them from. They were placed there 240 some years ago, rather roughly and briskly, and probably with not a whole lot of ceremony. It would be nice to more fully recognize who they are and their humanity and what was there, who they were. They had no intention of dying in that spot or ever being buried in a Ford ditch in New Jersey.
Yeah, and in that same sense, are there any European historians interested in this discovery, or?
We've had some discussion with archaeologists in Germany at this point. And we have a number of scholars in the United States. Frederica Barr is likely to be involved in the work that we're doing. Dr. Robert Selig will be involved in the work we're doing. I think as it gets known further afield, you'll find other people who may be able to offer some assistance. We've had some assistance offered from a variety of places, so we're working on developing that network.
Okay, great. And I guess a final question would be, if people want to learn or keep up with, the work that you all are doing, what's the best way somebody can keep following this project as you guys learn more?
That's a good question. Red Bank Battlefield Park does have a Facebook page. So if you're interested in what we plan to do would be another public archaeology program similar to the one that we did this year. That would be next summer. And that would need interested volunteers who want to come out and participate. It'd be great to have people come out who are interested in the project. It's a really exciting spot to work, and there's a lot of potential. The last time I worked there 7 years ago, we found a fragment of a cannon. So, when you find a fragment of a canyon, and then the next time you find a gold coin, I figured that was best it could possibly be. And then now it turns out that we have human remains as well. So that site continues to yield amazing archaeological discoveries. So I think that's probably the right place to look if you want to go to the Red Bank Battlefield Park webpage. If people are interested, I can give you my email address if people really want to know. And it's just my name at gmail.com.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think you got some other programs coming up at various different institutions. So I think it's fascinating to be able to tell this story. And I'm glad it's gotten as much coverage as it has, because I think this is, pretty fascinating that people think, this story and this history is a long part of the past, but we're continuing to learn more and more about these stories, and to actually find the physical evidence of it is just fascinating. So. Well, I want to thank you, Wade, for joining us tonight. Everybody who's watching, hope you enjoyed it. Be sure, like I said, keep following us at Emerging Revolutionary War. Like I said, we have a bus tour in 2 weeks. We will have another talk. We just had a new book come out about some of the smaller engagements that happened in New Jersey in 1777 and 1778, Unhappy Catastrophes by historian Bert Dunkerley. So be sure to check that out while you can, and we're talk to us in a couple weeks. Thank you, Wade, and appreciate it. And hopefully we'll get you back on, maybe to talk about some other projects you've worked on, like Cooch's Bridge and things like that. I think you get a lot. stuff about that, which is great.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.